Well, hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching The Big Picture with me, Frank Pereira. Screaming headlines this morning proclaim that India's largest corporate fraud has been discovered at the state-owned Punjab National Bank. And the alleged fraudster, billionaire jeweler Nirav Modi, may have already fled the country. Some other reports suggest Modi is willing to clear a part of the fraudulent loans. This brings to mind striking similarities between the modus operandi of Modi and another Indian billionaire who used and abused the state-owned banks, Ajay Malla. Any charges of crony capitalism after the latest PNB saga will be hard to deflect. Another state-owned bank, Bank of Baroda, is already under the scanner for alleged compliance lapses in South Africa pertaining to advances it made to one influential Indian business family there. On this edition of The Big Picture, we will analyze the extent of the PNB fraud and its implications for the banking sector. Joining me on the Big Picture today are Ajay, former Secretary, Ministry of Commerce and Industry; Subhomoy, Bhattacharjee, Consulting Editor of the Business Standard; Malla, former CMD IDBI Bank; and Renu, Kohli, former staff member RBI and International Monetary Fund. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of The Big Picture. Mr. Dua, I'd like to start with you, of course. What is the magnitude of the fraud and what exactly went wrong?
What's been reported is that the Punjab National Bank, through issue of letters of understanding, valued at $1.77 billion, which is roughly 11,000 crores, has been frauded of this amount of money. We do not know, once further investigations are done, whether there are many other cases, not just case of this particular jeweler whom you named and his extended family, but this itself, even if you don't find anything else, I think there is going to be a very major effect of this particular case itself, and that would be not only upon the Punjab National Bank, but other three banks who have honored these letters of guarantee. These are like letters of credit or bank guarantees.
Sure.
And if those banks, and they have two of them have already come into the open by saying, we just honored these instructions which had been sent to us under the SWIFT global payment system. So there is no practice to verify these because they have been vetted and they have followed a procedure. So they are trying to absolve themselves, whereas the Punjab National Bank has, or its management has reportedly said, why didn't you check? Why didn't you verify if there were such huge amounts which were coming? So going forward, I think, one, it's going to bring to the fore that there is a systemic lack of risk management and auditing practices for good corporate governance in the banks. I wish it were only in the public sector banks, but if you were to look at certain figures which have come out today, both a statement made by the Law Minister in Parliament some time ago, when he talked of 25,600 fraud cases covering 1,77,000 crores covered by them, and some data which has come out from the RBI, that the magnitude of these fraud cases, and for every fraud case doesn't necessarily mean...
You're making a very valid point. Let me go to Mr. Malla and ask him, why are banks so susceptible to these kind of frauds, Mr. Malla?
Essentially, let's not put a very gloomy picture. Banks in India over the years have a very robust risk system. And each bank, as my colleague Mr. Dua was saying, has systems which are able to protect itself. And that is, let me give figures. I'm not justifying anyone or anything here. Of the 80 lakh, 90 lakh crore loan which is outstanding today, and over the years, the banking system must have given maybe 5 times this amount, which has come back to the system. There is always some case where some lapse happens. And as we read the newspapers, this line of credit, when initially would have been given, I'm sure the Punjab National Bank is a very fine bank. They must have assessed that what is the credit rating of the concerned company and given them some limit. But actually, these limits are to be renewed every year. And on the basis of the risk perception, the margin money is taken. In fact, I read in the papers in the month till January, the amount was coming back, and only in January, when the bank decided to increase the margin by another 10%, which the borrower was unable to pay, and again by newspapers, then they went into it and found that there was some connivance of certain employees, which is very shocking to me.
So what is the SOP in a case like this?
See, first of all, there should be nothing which should be out of core banking system of a bank. So it is really surprising how it has happened and how it got escaped.
Because I'm sure there are checks and balances.
Of course, and banks have a very strong internal audit systems, and each bigger branch, and more so in the trade where this problem has happened, all banks have a system, and it should have got detected much earlier. So I'm really surprised why it did not get detected earlier. But one thing is certain, that the risk will have to be borne by PNB if their letters are genuine.
Indeed.
In the sense other banks will not suffer. So it will not have a contagion effect, but it's a huge, huge issue, and all banks have to again visit their systems.
Indeed. You know, Subhomoy Bhattacharjee, what are the implications really for the banking sector on the whole?
Even before this case came along, big question that was going around in India was that are the banks entitled to recapitalization? And that was predicated on the view that many of the loans that had gone sour was basically because of banks not doing due diligence. Now, you know, this is a very big word, due diligence. In what way, which respect? Mr. Malla has just explained that there are lots of checks and balances which go through the system. And that's true. I mean, it's harsh to say bankers have don't do it, don't look at it. But to the public, politically, when this is to be taken on, the big question will be: do the banks deserve a bailout? It'll be very difficult now for any government to say that I give a recapitalization to the bank when I am faced with the fact that there's been a fraud which has been going on for years. Whether it was detected, what were the steps taken at the time, 11,640 or 740, that number didn't spring overnight.
True.
It was the cumulative number of frauds that had happened over the years. So that means not just one person, there would have been several systemic points at which those gaps would have been left uncovered. So when the banks say that we have uncovered our other NPAs, the people's suspicion would be that they actually may not know of many more such things. Letters of credit were not supposed to be NPAs. These are trade credit. The NPAs that have happened on manufacturing side. There are loans of a different genre altogether. Trade credit is supposed to be very safe credit. You know, it just sort of rolls over and keeps and extremely liquid. If there we are facing India's largest ever corporate fraud, then we've got a serious problem in terms of the systems that the banks have.
Sure.
And whether the bank managements have understood. And my biggest worry is that this would make it, going forward, very difficult for anybody to say that the banks need the protection, and governments will have it extremely difficult to, in an election year, to say that, you know, we will give the support that they need.
All right. Let me bring in Renu Kohli into the picture now. You know, Ms. Kohli, what are the loopholes that were exploited in the PNB fraud case, and how do we plug some of these loopholes?
See, from the information that is available so far, and I doubt if all the complete mechanics of the fraud is publicly known as yet or described, I personally find it unbelievable that the fraud has been going on since 2011, and it was the connivance of two people on that desk, one of whom was a DGM. Now, it is well known that people get rotated and transferred out from that system, from one seat to another. And besides, even if they are posted in the same place for such a long time, they tend to go on leave, which can be extending to 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 1 month. So it boils down to your what were the internal risk management systems, internal risk control mechanisms. It is well known that there are two sets of transactions. One of them, the fund-based, typically go through the core banking solutions, and the others like SWIFT transactions, etc., which against which LOUs are given. And LOU is just a guarantee, and which is valid for 90 days for availing of credit lines from either PNB or the other banks. And in this case, there have been overseas branches involved, and there were nostro accounts which were So, at some point, these transactions have to be reconciled. And apparently, the interbank reconciliation or the reconciliation of these accounts and these transactions through the SWIFT system have not taken place. So, that is one huge breach of internal risk management guidelines that appears to have taken place. Even the staff is supposed to be rotated. That also apparently would have been breached if the fraud indeed has been going on since 2011. I find that very hard to believe that there was no reconciliation of interbank transactions through the SWIFT mechanism for such a long period. And the third is that, of course, that the structure is that there is the core banking solution and these SWIFT transactions, etc., are not integrated internally, and they actually ought to be integrated. And so obviously there is a huge breach of internal risk management guidelines. I mean, it speaks volumes about how these internal risk management has taken place and controls.
Okay, sure. Yes, Mr. Dua, you wanted to add something.
If one looks at the details which are available, all these LOUs were issued by a particular branch in Bombay called the Brady House branch of PNB, and a lot of these LOUs have been honored in Hong Kong by three banks, two public sector banks, I can name them, Allahabad Bank, the Union Bank, and a private sector bank called the Axis Bank. The government, probably the government or the bank, has acted against 10 employees other than the two who were at this particular branch. If it is localized between, a particular overseas branch of these three banks and a branch issuing here, then probably it's not a fraud which had spread out or made the whole system, wasn't so contagious as to have affected the entire trading activity of the bank or of other banks on whom they were issued. But that's my hope, my fervent wish, that that's how it's limited. It's not so very well spread out. But the fact of the matter is, what I'm concerned about is a point just now which Renu made. Where was the conciliation taking place? Accounts of any transaction, whether they are in the core banking system, whether they are issued by SWIFT or RTGS and the NIFT, which are in Indian systems, not necessarily SWIFT is for overseas payments, etc. If those are not taking place, then we might see at other branches also this kind of thing happening. So I would hold, and we are just discussing before coming in, that this is something which the board of directors of the banks are required under the company law itself, under the Reserve Bank guidelines itself, to make sure that there is a robust system of risk management in position. There is a system, the auditors are allowed to have an independent say, and the risk system.
Like Mr. Malla was just saying in his first submission, he said that these all these measures are all in place, but in spite of that this has happened.
No. I fully understand what you are saying. The banking system has lent so much money. If you compare it with that, this is a very small amount. But anywhere in the world, I would say, if there have been 25,000 frauds in the banks and 1,77,000 crores admitted by the minister on the floor of the parliament, and according to the RBI data, what I was trying to say, the extent and the volume and the per unit money involved of late has increased tremendously.
Sure.
Over 1 lakh of crore rupees in 500 odd cases has been reported to the Reserve Bank only in the first 9 months of last year.
All right. Looking at the magnitude of the fraud, the scam, whatever you would like to call it, Mr. Malla, can you say then that, it is just limited to 2 bank employees or 10 bank employees with, maximum is what Mr. Dua is suggesting? And how do you deal with these rogue elements?
See, I tend to agree, it would be limited to that purpose because generally all banks have a very robust system and so is PNB having a good system. So it has actually happened in this branch. And again, I'll say that probably all these years the payment was coming, new LCs were getting opened, so system was going on. Now, only thing is now it's a gap. Now, the issue is what is the security which this PNB has? Sure, they must be having two types of security, I believe, because we are going by what newspaper is telling us. One, of course, is the margin money, which will be lying in a cash somewhere. Second will be other securities. If you see today's statement of PNB, they have said that they are likely to recover. Now, but that's one part. But what really hurts as a person who has been dealing with the bank, that no fraud should happen. I mean, that should be the outer limit. Risk department should be so strong that they should actually have a veto power. And Reserve Bank of India has taken a number of initiatives. First time, now the chairman of a bank is a non-executive chairman and CEO is the managing director. Earlier, we used to have a CMD. So that bifurcation itself is very good. Audit department or audit head is always an independent director. And so systems are taking place. Now, only thing is our wish is that more and more time should be spent on these things. And gradually it should happen because I totally agree that nation cannot pay for the mistake of few people.
Indeed. You know, Subhomoy, can this be dismissed as a one-off incident, or do you think that it's a part of a larger problem, like Mr. Dua has said time and again on this program, that, 25,000 crores going up to the amount of
25,000 frauds.
25,000 frauds, I beg your pardon. 1.7 lakh crore rupees is what you said.
1,77,000.
Yes. Is it part of a bigger problem, or can this be dismissed as just a one-off incident?
The banking system anywhere in the world would be susceptible to fraud. So that's given. It's a question of checks and balances. The big problem is our level of prosecution for white-collar crime, our ability to take them to the logical conclusion is so weak that the public, the moment there's a description of a fraud, also comes to the conclusion that will not be punished. This is a dangerous connection or a chain that is established, which is what makes a fraud more painful. It's not about the number. Probably if we do an inter-country comparison of the Indian banking system's fraud, we might not come off worse. But we'll definitely come off worse when we look at the successful prosecutions that have happened for white-collar crimes. You started off the program by talking about Vijay Malla, and that has become such a torturous case. But that's not the only one. There have been so many down the line. Whichever the case is, the ability of the prosecuting agencies has been so weak, they've been riddled with so many problems, and on top of that comes the coating of what is called vested interest groups who are allowed to hold sway, that it becomes difficult for the public to believe that a fraud is simply just confined to a few employees. The systemic damage is very huge, and that is what we are dealing with. We wouldn't have been discussing this in this program had it just been a fraud in a day in a good bank. Punjab National Bank is a good bank. Canara Bank, Punjab Bank of Baroda, these are all powerful banks. State Bank of India. But today, when State Bank of India has been told to account for another 24,000 crore of NPA, the public immediately starts wondering whether it is just NPA or whether it is a fraud. And it makes it so much more difficult then to even go for resolution of those NPAs. Because the moment a bank says, I'll take a haircut, the question starts becoming, people start asking that who is actually taking the haircut?
Sure.
Is it the public? Is it the shareholder? Is the haircut being done equitably? So, that is where these problems come along. It's a full change. They're not just a collection of the fraud, but also to the prosecution. If a successful prosecution happens, people are punished adequately, funds recovered, only then and gradually over time, it will not just happen once, would the public be able to accept that the banking system is the rightful repository of the people's money.
Indeed. Let me go across to Renu Kohli now. Talking about Punjab National Bank now, where does it stand after this fraud has come to light, and what are the implications for the bank itself?
From what we know so far, there is ambiguity about who will bear this liability of 113 or 17 billion rupees. PNB says that from what has been reported, it seems that there is some. PNB says the banks who honored this and did not check physically the guarantee issued are liable. There is another report which says that the RBI says that it is PNB shall bear the entire liability. So there is, of course, the financial aspect of it, because it's apparently this is about almost 50 times its net profit, which was reported in the December quarter, according to one news report. So, these details will only be awaited. PNB has also said that Nirav Modi has written to them that he is willing to repay something like close to 50 billion rupees. Nonetheless, there will still be a thing. It's also a spotlight upon lapses. Because, clearly, even these SWIFT transactions or these kind of transactions which do not go through the CBS, the core banking solution, there is somebody, another official who is besides the dealing official, who is supposed to check it either on a daily basis, the logbook or the logs of the transaction log on a daily, or if not a weekly basis. It's also supposed to be reported. So, there is a huge lapse out there, and my sense is that the RBI probably will conduct a kind of a scan or a quick thing of all banks across India.
Okay.
In fact, this is something which is, it's an age-old practice of manner in which frauds are taken place. It's just issuing an LC, which has a 90 days duration, and you go to another bank and you avail of credit against that. And it's typical banking practice that no bank dishonors a guarantee given out by another bank.
Sure, okay.
So, there are implications of all that as well.
Talking about who's going to foot the bill in the long run, is it the taxpayer who's going to be who's going to be burdened with this, Mr. Dua?
Absolutely. Other than 2,000 crores, for which the transactions went through the Axis Bank, which is now private. The remaining amount, 9,000 crores, if it's 11,000, is between 3 public sector banks and maybe another odd public sector bank with a smaller amount. The 9,000 crores clearly, whether it is Punjab National Bank or the other 2 or 3 banks, it will be the taxpayer who will be bearing it. Whatever we are able to get from Mr. Nirav Modi, as and when he is found, as and when he is brought to book, prosecuted, the word which so more very rightly used, then only we will be able to get it off. My concern is, all right, this is one case, and I'm willing to accept that it's a one-off, but it has brought to light so many failures. Just to give an example of what Mr. Malla and Renu, who know the banking system far better than us, mentioned, to issue any SWIFT transaction, or leave alone SWIFT, to authorize any NIFT or RTGS also, in the bank, it's his first column maker, then there is a checker, the guy who looks at the computer again, then it's a verifier. So how all these, only then the LOU is given.
Yes.
It seems that all this 6 years, from 2011 to 2018, say 7 years, nobody is really in this particular branch. This system was not in position, because otherwise, why do you catch only 2 guys? A deputy GM, who is a fairly senior guy, he is probably authorized, and he has a front man who's, because he's a deputy GM involved, neither verifier nor the checker is involved. This guy makes it, and that guy authorizes that it goes. So my concern is that credibility of the Indian public sector banks, which because of the NPAs, which doubled up in, ever since the instructions were given, why doubled up? From 3.6% to 9.6%.
Yes.
In last April 2017, almost 3 times. That's going to take a hit.
Okay.
The stock market, most of the are listed. Their valuation has gone down.
Okay. I'm running out of time. So one final closing comment from Mr. Malla on how do we further strengthen or secure our banking system?
See, it's an eye-opener, of course, and I'm sure, it's not that the maker, checker, sometimes there is a front office, mid office and back office. So it's not that people would not have seen. I'm only intrigued by one press release which says that till January everything was okay, but when bank asked for additional 10% margin, it was not given by the borrower, and that's why the limits were withdrawn. So that's one intrigue in the sense that
retired.
so
Actually,
they cancelled all the underwritings. Now, of course, you cannot cancel an underwriting in between. So the banks who have lent against those underwritings are rightfully claimant, and they should get their money back. And this should actually motivate all the banks to again look at their system once again.
Okay, all banks need to take a relook at their security systems, their risk management needs to be rechecked is what you're suggesting. On that note, we'll call it a wrap on this edition of The Big Picture. I'd like to thank all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us. That's it from me. See you again next time.